Good evening, everybody. My name is Vince Kazmierski. I'm the chair of the Department of Law and Legal Studies here at Carleton University, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this, our first Chet Mitchell lecture of the 2019-2020 academic year. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge that the land upon which we are gathered is the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. We thank them for their hospitality. The Chet Mitchell Lecture is named for a colleague in our department who passed away in 1991 at the tender age of 42. Chet had a profound impact despite the fact that he was a member of the department for only 7 years before his untimely passing. He was a popular and enthusiastic instructor in a number of areas, most notably criminal law and medical legal issues. His areas of research and interest were eclectic, but he had a remarkable ability to bridge and connect ideas, theories, and examples, much like our speaker tonight. He published over 15 refereed articles, edited special issues for 2 journals, and just before his death published a book, The Drug Solution, Regulating Drugs According to the Principles of Efficiency, Justice, and Democracy. Chet contributed to the administrative life of the department and enriched many a conversation with lively debate. A colleague commented at the time of his death that Chet's warm and generous spirit, his kind and inquisitive nature, and his keen and challenging intellect will be greatly missed within the department, by his students, and by all who knew him. To honor Chet's legacy, every year we invite public figures, jurists, and academics who share his passion and generous spirit, and who engage with issues in legal studies and social justice to deliver the Chet Mitchell Lecture. It's my pleasure to welcome Professor Quinn Slobodian to deliver this year's Chet Mitchell Lecture, and I now invite Professor Umut Osu to introduce him more formally. Umut.
Thank you so much for being here. Above all, thank you to Quinn Slobodian himself. Quinn is unquestionably one of the most influential younger scholars working in the humanities and social sciences today. He'll be embarrassed that I say that, but it happens to be true. Trained as a historian of modern Germany and international history, Quinn began his academic career working on the social, cultural, and political relations between West and East Germany, and what during the Cold War was typically termed the Third World. His first book, Foreign Front, Third World Politics in 60s West Germany, was published by Duke University Press in 2012. It provides a nuanced and fascinating account of the activism of students from the so-called Third World in West Germany. This interest continued in a wonderful collection that Quinn edited titled Comrades of Color, East Germany in the Cold War World, published by Berghahn in 2015. Since that time, Quinn has gradually expanded his interests, amplified them, writing on a wide range of issues relating to the history of contemporary capitalism, particularly the role played by German-speaking economists, lawyers, and other thinkers in the intellectual and organizational construction of what some, including Philip Mirowski, have termed the neoliberal thought collective. The principal result of this new focus thus far, there's a lot more to come, has been Quinn's second book titled Globalists. Here I can brandish a copy right here. It's a great, great book, The End of Empire and the Birth of Neoliberalism, which was published by Harvard University Press in 2018. A beautiful and eye-opening book, it truly is. Globalists, an instant classic, has contributed significantly to our understanding of the history of capitalism. In particular, it has helped to reinforce the view that neoliberalism is a real movement, best understood not as a call for deregulation or an across-the-board critique of state power, but rather as a push for re-regulation, for transforming and redeploying state power, particularly on the international plane after the end of European empire and colonialism. It's been very widely acclaimed, very widely reviewed, including by one graduate student here at Carleton, who's with us today. And it's recently received the American Historical Association's Beer Prize in European Intellectual History, International History, rather, since 1895, a very prestigious award. Quinn's current research and his current book project relates to the intimate relationship between the neoliberal movement on the one hand and the contemporary far right on the other. And it's on that topic, some of the themes that come along with it, that he'll speak today. So without further ado, Quinn.
Thanks everybody for coming today. Thanks to Carleton University for inviting me, giving me the chance to touch the soil of my homeland's capital for the first time. So what I'll be talking about today is part of my current attempt to engage with what I think are some of the misguided declarations since 2016. That one, neoliberalism was dead again, and two, that what we've been witnessing since then is a backlash of the populace fueled by those left behind by globalization against the globalists, a kind of transnational elite that believes, we're told, in multilateralism, unfettered finance, and apparently laughing at globalization's left behinds. I've always been dissatisfied by this framing, and my current book project is about substantiating the dissatisfaction and offering a narrative of my own, one that shows that I think we're witnessing less a backlash than a frontlash, and one where the most important actors are not actually the disgruntled voters of the heartland, but a cast of elites themselves dissatisfied with the settlement of the so-called long 1990s. I think what we're seeing is an intensification of dynamics of global capitalism, not their lessening. But the ideological expression does look different from what we've seen before. Some of you might know the meme of this anime guy looking at a butterfly. I think many of us scholars are in this situation where the butterfly says, far-right populism, and the guy is asking himself, is this neoliberalism? I'm a historian, so I'm going to give my talk largely today by way of a story about bankruptcy as a style of politics, and the challenge of vulture capitalism to our ideas of neoliberalism. The possibility also that the ongoing Trump moment we find ourselves in can help us think more clearly about the role of the state in the practice of actual existing neoliberalism. So here goes. At the end of history, Donald J. Trump was going bankrupt. The Trump Taj Mahal, the jewel in the crown of his Atlantic City empire, which he had acquired in a high-stakes competition with his rival, the television game show mogul Merv Griffin, was going into receivership in 1990, and Trump stood to lose a great deal of money. Advising the creditors, which included later Trump advisor Carl Icahn, was a man in his early 50s named Wilbur Ross Jr., who had worked for the storied financial house of Rothschild since the mid-1970s and became the head of their bankruptcy unit in the 1990s. In an act of what many saw at the time as magnanimity, Ross negotiated a deal that allowed Trump to retain a controlling stake in the Taj Mahal. It was a favor, of course, that Trump would return 27 years later when he made Ross his most powerful trade official, his commerce secretary. The Taj Mahal, though, was not Wilbur Ross's largest deal of the 90s. Far from it. By the end of the decade, he'd been involved in 8 of the largest 25 largest corporate bankruptcies in American history. In 5 years alone, from 1985 to 1990, his team of 15 represented holders of $30 billion in bonds. The 80s and the 90s saw an unprecedented number of corporate bankruptcies for a few different reasons. The first was the wave of hostile takeovers and leveraged buyouts in the 1980s, in the course of which is the astounding figure of 1/3 of the largest corporations in the United States had disappeared as independent entities. The merger boom was made possible, of course, by changes in antitrust laws, which made real what Mont Pelerin Society member and founder of law and economics, Henry Mann, called a, quote, market for corporate control in 1965. As scholars describe it, in this period, corporations went from being seen as more or less stable entities with an inside and an outside to being a nexus of contracts, a network capable of being pulled apart, recombined, chopped up, and repartitioned in the interest not of increasing profits in the sense of revenue to costs, but the value of the stock price in the short term. Because these mergers were highly leveraged, meaning they relied on a high degree of debt based on the anticipated value of the company being acquired, many of them quite predictably went bankrupt. The spike was actually pretty breathtaking. The volume of publicly held assets in bankruptcy grew from $5 billion in 1985 to $72 billion just 4 years later. Luckily for them, going bankrupt wasn't such a big deal anymore. A new law passed in 1979 allowed managers to remain in control of the corporations even after filing for bankruptcy, or Chapter 11 as it's known in the US. Bankruptcy could actually be a good thing. As one researcher at a brokerage described it in 1987, quote, when a company goes into bankruptcy, it enters a sort of state of grace. It pays no interest on all of its debt. Its contracts are unenforceable. All this allows a company to do is shut down facilities, trim employment, so when they come out of bankruptcy, they really are poised again to be a competitive organization. End quote. The idea was to preserve the productive parts of the corporation and purge the unproductive ones. In his Nobel speech in 1990, one of the economists who defended this idea, Merton Miller, cited Trump's own Atlantic City bankruptcy to argue that, quote, life support provided by the law meant that the value of the corporation would outlast the trauma of bankruptcy. Ross himself put this in a pithier form at the time when he called bankruptcy, quote, the corporate form of Darwinism. This era saw the advent of what are now called business as usual bankruptcies. The clothing retailer Forever 21, for example, is going through one right now. And I passed a Forever 21 a few weeks ago in Boston. Outwardly, it looks like nothing is different, nothing has changed. But internally, of course, much is afoot. In the jargon of the industry, there are restructurings, workouts, and turnarounds. Who ended up at the business end of the purge? Who or what is considered non-functional in the natural selection process of corporate Darwinism? The brunt of changes, of course, are always borne by the workers. Funds intended for wages or pensions were often consumed by costs during the bankruptcy proceedings. For example, paying for advice from specialists like Ross, who boasted that professional fees of $3 or even $5 million a month were not unusual in the 1980s. These broken promises to workers were referred to by an evocative term, quote, betrayal without remedy. Those particular commitments had entered a space of discretion and non-enforceability. Another change of the law in the 1970s meant that one of the things you could do during a bankruptcy was to offload pension obligations onto the state itself, which would pay them at a reduced rate through the so-called Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation. This and other innovations meant that since the 1980s, we have been in an era of what scholars call, quote, strategic bankruptcy. This is bankruptcy without stigma, without guilt, without shame, just good business sense. Wilbur Ross was in early to this expanding field of bankruptcies, starting to specialize in 11s already in 1983. By 87, he advised on the biggest corporate bankruptcy in US history as oil giant Texaco filed with $21.6 billion in liabilities. Chapter 11 has become an important corporate finance tool, Ross said in 1988. Ross saw himself, interestingly, as an organizer. Quote, bondholders, that is, people who companies owe money to, are like workers in a factory, he said in 1990. Quote, if some rabble-rouser pulls them together, meaning himself, they have a better chance of getting a fair deal. Here is a peculiar kind of class struggle. Not workers against management, but bondholders against management. But many of the familiar words from class struggle are here. Activism, muscular demands, militancy, shareholder revolt. Though this might seem peculiar on the surface, it's actually consistent with the idea that scholars like Alexander Galas have proposed recently, that we can't understand Reaganism or Thatcherism without seeing how it mobilized insurgent rhetoric aimed both downward, of course, against the supposedly idle unionized workers, but also upwards at the supposedly idle CEO aristocracy, which needed to be jolted into greater productivity and innovation through shareholder and bondholder pressure. For Wilbur Ross Jr., bad time means boom times, said the Wall Street Journal in 1988. They could have been paraphrasing from Rosa Luxemburg from 7 decades earlier, when she wrote that, quote, business thrives in the ruins. From the midst of the First World War, she described, quote, the hoarse cries of the vulture and the hyenas of the battlefield, profiting economically from violence. Rosa would have approved of the term that emerged then by the late 1980s for funds specializing in bankrupt or ailing companies. They became known in the pages of the financial press, not the Marxist journals, as vulture funds. The financial players in charge were called vulture investors or vulture capitalists, and these are the terms, again, pulled from the pages of the Financial Times, not the New Left Review. A 1990 Legal Review piece described vulture funds as, quote, the new player on the financial scene, institutional investors that bought ailing bonds at a fraction of their face amount in anticipation of a restructuring. The term, of course, was a neat subversion of the better-known venture fund. While venture capital seeded potential future money-making endeavors, Vulture Capital found formerly profitable companies and figured out how to deploy state and legal power to shed deadweight and restore their stock value, at least long enough to sell them on again. Wilbur Ross was the quintessential vulture capitalist and was often recognized as such in the press. In 1998, Fortune magazine called him the king of bankruptcy. Investment Dealer's Digest called him the king of restructurings. Both of these things, of course, meant positively. In 1997, Ross started a $200 million vulture fund at Rothschild before starting his own private equity firm, W.L. Ross and Company, in 2000. What followed this was a kind of extraordinary period of 2 decades when Ross became a kind of Forrest Gump of global capitalism, seemingly present at every moment of crisis, cataclysm, or transformation. This was, of course, not a coincidence, because it was precisely there where the money was to be made. While it's impossible really to do justice to the full breadth of his career, it's worth revisiting a few highlights. After assisting Bill Clinton on privatization, he was a Democrat until Trump, in the former Soviet Union, in 1997, Ross was one of the first foreign investors into South Korea in a major way after the Asian financial crisis. As Barron's reported in a somewhat admiring tone in 1998, quote, "Unemployment is high and rising, economies are shrinking, and companies are going bankrupt by the score. In some countries, food riots have become commonplace. For Wilbur Ross, this is the ideal milieu." Ross's fund bought the debt of Korea's largest international auto parts manufacturer, cracking into the chaebols, which had been notoriously resistant to outside ownership until then. Korean workers were also notoriously militant, and one of the features of the settlement after decades of dictatorship was that when the workers went on strike, they tend to get what they wanted. Lifetime employment, although not legally secured, was effectively the norm. Things changed with Ross in charge. After he pushed through a painful restructuring of the company, 4,000 workers went on strike and protest. Ross overruled the Korean managers who wanted to cede to the demands and pressured the state to crack down on them. Quote, "I simply made it obvious to the company that if the unrest continued, it would make Mando financially non-viable," Ross said at the time. The state complied, sending in 8,000 police with bulldozers and tear gas to break the multi-city strike. 1/4 of workers were fired, and 25 trade union leaders went to prison, the first time that the new government had used force against strikers. In a perverse but symptomatic twist that says much about the ethical conundrums thrown up by this era of financialization, a major contributor to Wilbur Ross's fund, and thus co-owners of this Korean auto parts manufacturer, was the California Public Employees Pension, CalPERS, meaning unionized US workers were profiting from strike breaking happening on the other side of the world. Another career highlight for Ross came a few years later when he began to buy up bankrupt and ailing steel companies in 2001, eventually merging them into something called the International Steel Group. His timing was immaculate and almost certainly not coincidental, as it was just then that pressure from steel lobbies led George W. Bush to break with the post-1995 global free trade consensus to put tariffs on steel in 2002. With steel prices momentarily buoyed by the tariffs, Ross sold the company to Lakshmi Mittal in May 2005, forming the core of what would become the world's largest steel company, ArcelorMittal, on whose board Ross sat until he took the post of Commerce Secretary in 2017. For the brief period that it profited him to take the stand, Ross became a vociferous critic of free trade. In 2003, he launched a new lobbying group called the Free Trade for America Coalition, FreeTAC, and boasted of being the first representative from management to attend an anti-free trade rally alongside the United Steelworkers. His hope, of course, was that the protection given to steel would be extended to other sectors where he was buying up distressed and ailing assets, hoping that the International Steel Group's success would be followed by a new firm he had created called the International Textile Group, snapping up bankrupt companies in that sector. When a second coming of this protectionist put ended up not being forthcoming, Ross deftly flipped his message, supporting precisely the kind of treaty he'd opposed in the Central American Free Trade Agreement, or CAFTA, earning the justified label of turncoat from his former organized labor allies and friends. Ross explained his logic when he discussed adding a denim plant in Guatemala City to his already existing overseas textile operations. Quote, "Guatemala is a very logical place from a CAFTA point of view," he said. "The normal wage in this industry is a little under $200 a month. That's getting down towards China level, end quote. The following year, he went to the very bottom of the wage scale, breaking ground for a textile factory outside of Shanghai, performing the very act he had vociferously condemned to US textile workers just 2 years earlier. Ross's self-defense was telling. Asked by a reporter at the press conference whether he was advocating protectionism to preserve his own investments, he responded, quote, "It absolutely is. I don't see any reason why that should be criticized. Do you believe the foreign governments are protecting anyone's interests but their own? I doubt it." When pushed on his reversal in support for CAFTA, he repeated the theme, quote, "I believe that everyone in the industry should be acting in his or her own self-interest." Ross's status as a vulture capitalist meant an endless motility of rhetoric, a belief that an asset must always be talked up, down until the right point to buy, and up until the most advantageous moment to sell. The state and the law were simply accessories to this basic performance. While investors like Ross originally acquiesced to the label of vulture fund, by the early 2000s they began to feel that the label was maybe giving them the wrong reputation. They tried to rebrand, calling themselves instead after the kind of debt and assets that they specialized in, ones that were distressed. It's telling that both vulture funds and rebranded distressed debt specialists had their start in two sectors in the 1980s, finance and real estate. The one, of course, was the province of Ross. The other was the province of Trump himself. Trump's own rhetoric shows a marked continuity with Wilbur Ross's. First was his treatment of bankruptcy. In the course of Trump's 2016 campaign for candidate and then president, Trump had to fend off, of course, continual attacks related to his supposed multiple bankruptcies. His approach was always the same. First, to normalize the practice of filing for corporate bankruptcy, or throwing a company into a chapter, as he called it, by insisting that every wealthy business person in the country had done the same, which is, of course, true. And second, to insist that it was an act of instrumental legal practice. He had simply, quote, used the laws of the land to his own benefit. One of the most striking aspects of the vulture capitalist is their frankness about the deployment of state capacity to their own purposes. One of their nicknames is grave dancers. Another is ambulance chasers. In this case, the ambulance in question is, of course, the intervention of governments to bail out distressed firms, banks, and countries. To the vulture capitalists, central banks are not just the lender of last resort, or even the dealer of last resort in more recent formulations, but in the words of the co-founder of the private equity firm, the Carlyle Group, in a foreword to a textbook on distressed debt investing, quote, the credit enhancer of last resort. The state and its institutions in that sense do not only make the investment worthwhile, without them, there is no investment opportunity at all. The scavenger metaphor was also apt, as vulture capitalists not only relied on the loss of others, but were dependent on the action of the stronger actor to extract the remainder. The lion, again, in this metaphor, is not so much other companies as the state itself, the necessary complement to their business strategy. Trump has never shied from seeing the state and the law as accessories to private capital accumulation. In a telling moment testifying to Congress in 1991 about what he repeatedly called a depression, which he believed had been sparked by the lifting of tax shelters for the real estate industry, he asked, quote, "When do you think it's going to end? Nobody has the faintest idea. There's absolutely no hope, insight, unless something is done by the government to spur the economy, because the economy is not going to spur itself." No magic of the market, no rollback of the state, no fantasies of self-regulation, just a command that the state do what it's supposed to do. Buttress elite power through enabling the ongoing reaping of rewards by the strongest economic players. In Trump's rhetoric, the nation itself is often treated as a distressed asset. When he first entered the political arena in 1987, flirting with a run for president, one of his recurrent talking points was, as he put it, that, quote, if the United States were a country, if the United States were a company, it would be bankrupt. This country is losing $200 billion a year, he said. Eventually, everything is going to blow up because this country is essentially a bankrupt country. If a company or a country ever ran the way the United States is running, forget it. To propose, of course, that a country might go bankrupt is not quite as ridiculous as it seems. Only a few years earlier, Mexico had defaulted on its own loans, sparking what would become the Third World debt crisis. The defaulting of Trump's own New York City on its debt in the late 1970s is often seen as a significant road marker on the path to the so-called neoliberal era. The emergence of sovereigns as debtors and the multiplication of municipal bonds in the 1980s made cities and countries credit risks like any other. Countries don't go bankrupt, of course, was the quote attributed to Citibank head Walter Wriston, which had emboldened foreign lending in the era of petrodollars in the 1970s. Yet, what could happen, the 1980s taught, was that so-called structural adjustment involving slashing of public spending and the privatization of public assets might follow a default. A country might not die, but it may also never be the same after its near-death experience. Like a company run through restructuring, a workout, or a turnaround, the state and the law could provide just enough life support to carry through a cleansing process of, in Ross's words, corporate Darwinism in action. This, then, I think, is one way to see politics since the crisis of 2008, as a form of distressed neoliberalism, a modified vulture capitalism, which dispenses with all of the fuzzy pieties of the magic of the self-regulating market, the personalizing stigma and shame of debt, and the talk of rolling back the state. Our scholarship on neoliberalism has been arguably too focused on looking at those most disempowered by what Michel Fehr calls actual existing neoliberalism. By focusing on the indebted man of Maurizio Lazzarato and the weaker state facing punitive neoliberalism, whether it's Greece or Argentina, we miss the Rosses and the Trumps at the other end of the spectrum, those who lived in confidence that the state was designed to work for them. The disconnect between Trump's understanding of bankruptcy and the vernacular one, whether it's at the proverbial account balancing of the kitchen table or the chants of Zuccotti Park, is understandable. The two kinds of bankruptcy are not the same. In fact, the last several years has seen a deepening of the gap or a widening of the gap between personal and corporate bankruptcy. The 2005 Bankruptcy Code, which Elizabeth Warren argued against, tightened restrictions on personal bankruptcy. Student loans, as we all likely know, cannot be defaulted on in the United States. There is an inescapable contradiction between the injunction to live within one's means for the average American and the profit to be made through over-leveraging and living beyond one's means in the case of the wealthy and corporate leaders. The economic philosophy of Trump and his cabinet capitalizes on this disconnect, invoking the charmed quality of private sector activity, which seems to sail magically between the punitive territories of personal debt on one hand and sovereign debt on the other. Trump and many members of his cabinet enjoy what appears like an aura of corporate immunity. It's less important that they are good businessmen or creative entrepreneurs than they seem to know how to play the system. Metis, or situated knowledge, is much more important than genius or wonkery. The attempts to tar Trump with the stigma of debt and bankruptcy misfire, and they actually boomerang. Indeed, his ability to be the self-described king of debt and still thrive gives him an aura of invulnerability. He embodies the bulletproof status that decades of legal change have granted him, if not intentionally, then incidentally. Not so much neoliberalism's Frankenstein, as Wendy Brown has recently suggested, as neoliberalism's swamp thing, composed of the organic matter of the business world, pure corporate praxis, not purely the detritus of the racist, xenophobic hinterland, as in the accepted descriptions, although that's part of it, but the residue of the distressed assets preyed on by Ross himself. It is a fact that is both entirely obvious, yet still not considered enough, that Trump is the first president to come directly out of the private sector. His experience as a businessman in the last 40 years of US-led global capitalism has taught him that the correct lesson is that the system is designed to socialize risks and privatize profits. It's all too easy to see Ross and Trump as men without system, pragmatists or nihilists seeking short-term opportunities as they arise. But what if this very pragmatism is the essence of a particular kind of an attitude to governance, one far from the constitutionalism of the ordoliberals or the lawyers seeking equality before the law? Our existing scholarship on the hyper-wealthy can tend to reify the existence of the super-rich in a market space somehow beyond the control of states. To say that global financial markets, for example, operate, quote, de facto above the law, as Etienne Balibar has written recently, or that they constitute an autonomous deterritorialized market people, as Wolfgang Streeck has described it, does not actually describe well the world of Ross and Trump. We have been, I think, too enchanted by this beguiling image of vectors of capital and goods zigzagging the globe in lasers, and not attentive enough to the way, as Katerina Pistor puts it, assets are coded in law and never actually leave the earth. Wealth and the wealthy work through the law, not above it. This is also important to qualify our vision of the neoliberal subject. Will Davis describes, quote, the ideal neoliberal agent as a type of cyborg who is able to mediate constantly between the capital at his fingertips and the quantitative data relayed by the market without stopping to reflect consciously on what it's doing. His image calls to mind a century of associations, from the stock trader staring at the ticker tape in the late 19th century to the protagonist of Don DeLillo's Cosmopolis gliding in an armored limousine through Manhattan with his fingertips hovering over touchscreens. Yet, the vulture capitalist using the laws of this country is a different kind of an actor. She watches the ayes and nays of Congress in session as closely as the rise and fall of indices. She is hyper-conscious that, in Trump's words, quote, the economy will not spur itself. The fickleness and flickering opinions in politics of the vulture capitalists is disconcerting to scholars of neoliberalism that tend to seek a kind of order in the reconstruction of ideology. It's for this reason that we are drawn to the core text, and I'm including myself, to the core text of sort of neoliberal thought's founders, the Walter Euckens and the Ruptures and the Gary Beckers and the Franz Booms. Yet, one of the signature traits of the distressed neoliberalism of the vulture capitalists is its indifference to the totality. Vulture capitalists born from the era of angling within financialization pay no mind to the whole, or rather they outsource concern for the whole to central banks, the IMF, the G7, the Bank of International Settlements in Basel. The notion of the guardian of the economic constitution, which neoliberals clearly saw as central, could not be more foreign to the vulture capitalists. They're not interested in being the guardians of the capitalist order. Watching vulture capitalism in practice and considering bankruptcy itself as a style of politics divests neoliberalism's critics of one of their most beloved gestures, the curtain-swiping revelation that the market does, in fact, rely on the apparatus of the state to survive. Shorn of resort to this pseudo-disclosure, critics on the left are adrift. What are they looking at, they wonder? The neologisms pile up. Neoliberalism, post-neoliberalism, punitive neoliberalism, authoritarian neoliberalism, mutant neoliberalism, zombie neoliberalism, reactionary nationalist, plutocratic neoliberalism, all real quotes. Arguably, too many of those rely on a kind of binary, whereby neoliberalism in normal times is constitutionalized, locking in capital rights, depoliticizing everyday decision-making. Moments of sovereign intervention or discretion, of exemption and exception, are often figured as supplements to, rather than replacements for, a constitutionalized neoliberalism. The example of vulture capitalism makes us wonder how much our definition of neoliberalism relies on spotting the repetition of certain rhetorical tropes and gestures. People talking about the virtues of free trade, the magical market, competition, free enterprise, consumer sovereignty. Why are we always looking for these keywords being dropped, even when state actions rarely conformed consistently to this dogma? What do we do when the language of liberty and freedom is jettisoned for the blunt statements of racial national hierarchy and zero-sum competition? When the message is rather, to prevent descent to the status of other shithole countries, the nation must undergo a bankruptcy, a painful restructuring where all cannot come out as winners. The Financial Times columnist Gillian Tett was one of the first and only to remark on the particularity of the composition of Trump's cabinet. It was composed of all corporate actors, yes, but a precious few, maybe only actually one, Rex Tillerson of Exxon, now long gone, were of the usual old-school management type. Rather, the others all came from the world of distressed debts and assets. Carl Icahn was an early advisor, Trump's model, specializing in distressed assets. Steve Mnuchin and Gary Cohn from Goldman Sachs specialized in short-term trades and undervalued stocks and other assets. For distressed debt players, Tett wrote, "Opportunism, not ideology, rules." I think our challenge as scholars, though, is to see if we can understand that very opportunism as an ideology of its own. Why attempt a diagnosis of the present parlous state of global politics with this lengthy description of mostly one man's career, namely Wilbur Ross? First, because I think existing histories, including my own, have sometimes ignored the material context for the emergence of neoliberal ideology at its peril. Second, because I think it helps to highlight the gap between the different methodologies currently used to understand neoliberalism. Those break down roughly between those who use the term neoliberalism to describe a certain practice of capitalism since the late 70s, and those who use it to describe a more or less self-conscious ideology articulated by a discrete group of people since the 1930s, organized loosely around the Mont Pelerin Society. As Balabar wrote recently, quote, "The name neoliberalism itself oscillates between an ideological discourse and actual transformations of economic institutions and practices." The fact is, though, if we can see one response to the post-2008 crisis and the distressed neoliberalism of Trump and Ross, we can also see a parallel response in more explicit ideological terms from neoliberals themselves. As I've described elsewhere, and I'm happy to discuss more in Q&A, the Eurozone crisis in particular brought to the surface a long-simmering division among neoliberal intellectuals associated with the Mont Pelerin Society about what fixes were necessary for global capitalism to survive. This is a form of neoliberalism itself in a state of distress, worried that previous solutions were no longer valid. The primary fault lines here cut through the questions of scale. Are supranational institutions boons or hindrances to the smooth functioning of capitalism? Questions of people. Are certain cultures or even races more capable of being productive market actors? And questions of money. Can monetary governance be constitutionalized, or will central banks always be swayed by democratic pressures in the end? The answers to these questions are of great consequence for the self-described neoliberals. They help explain the positions taken by parties like the Alternative for Germany, or the AfD, the hardcore Brexiteers in the British Conservative Party, the Austrian Freedom Party, along with assorted right-wing neoliberal parties like ODS in Czech Republic and VVD in the Netherlands. It also helps explain xenophobic libertarian currents that organize globally around the Ludwig von Mises Institutes, from Auburn, Alabama to Switzerland and Brazil. Openly ideological debates in libertarian and neoliberal circles express a feeling of a distressed neoliberalism in another sense. They have created there a serious rift in a movement that had more or less held together for decades, quite impressively actually. It has pushed some towards harsher borders for migrants and towards ever stronger demands for open borders on the other. Some towards secession from communities like the European Union, and others for a doubling down on the monetary constitution. Some have turned back to the gold standard or forward to crypto and blockchain. Others still see fiscal responsibility as possible within a democratic state. Some have embraced the bad science of evolutionary psychology and even scientific racism. Others remain devoted anti-racists and opponents of hubristic scientism. It's a time of great ferment in the neoliberal movement itself. But for me, the fact that it is easier to follow these latter text-based and meeting-based conversations does not mean that they're the most important ones to follow. If it's helpful to borrow one term, the idea of the distressed asset, from finance to help make sense of mutating attitudes to governance beyond the discussions of the Mont Pelerin Society neoliberals, it might also be worth importing another term, ever more in the news because it was mentioned by the new head of the IMF, Kristalina Georgieva. This is the idea not of the distressed, but of the stranded asset. Distressed neoliberalism relies on the ability to turn one person's loss into another person's profit, or at least enhance share value. This, in turn, relies on a minimally functional infrastructure of laws and enforcement. The stranded asset, though, raises another vision. What is meant by that is assets made inaccessible or valueless by either changing landscapes, that is, rising sea levels drown them, or changing norms, for example, a popular pivot away from carbon products that sinks that industry and keeps energy in the ground. I can't help but wonder, and I hope this is something that we can also discuss in the Q&A, whether keeping one eye on the materialist argument won't help us to theorize not only distressed neoliberalism, but perhaps the stranded neoliberalism that could follow it. Thank you.